Premier Protein is the textbook definition of selling trash at a premium, quite literally. To hit that 30 grams protein claim on the box without hurting their profits, they didn't choose quality. They chose fraud. By pumping the product full of cheap, worthless fillers, a trick known as amino spiking, they fooled the lab tests and tricked millions of people into thinking they were drinking actual nutrition. The result? Industrial sludge dressed up as health food and a laundry list of lawsuits they've been trying to bury. Challenging the chalky whey empire. It's hard to remember now, but wellness wasn't always a marketing buzzword. Long before Instagram models and gas station health foods, the world was a very different place. The year is 1999. The fitness world is a niche, intimidating subculture. If you wanted to build muscle in 1999, you didn't go to a boutique spin class or a luxury Equinox. You went to a dungeon-like gym filled with rusting iron plates and men who looked like they were carved out of granite. This was the era of bro science, a time when nutritional advice was passed down not by dietitians, but by the biggest guy in the room. And the first commandment of bro science was simple: protein. Bodybuilders believed that to grow, you had to consume ungodly amounts of protein, far more than you could get from chicken breasts and egg whites alone. This demand created a market for supplements. But the protein supplements of the late 90s were, to put it mildly, a culinary nightmare. At the time, protein almost exclusively came in the form of giant, terrifying tubs of powder. You bought them at GNC, General Nutrition Center, the cathedral of the muscle cult. These powders were expensive, messy, and chemically unstable. The ritual was humiliating. You would scoop a heap of chalky, vanilla-scented dust into a plastic shaker cup. You would add lukewarm tap water. You would shake it violently for 2 minutes. And the result? A clumpy, gritty sludge that tasted like cement mixed with artificial sweetener. You didn't drink it because you enjoyed it. You drank it because you had to. It was penance. It was the price of gains. It was into this hostile culinary landscape that joint venture laboratory stepped in. JVL was not a tech startup in Silicon Valley. It wasn't founded by a celebrity. It was a pragmatic operation based in California, run by people who understood food science better than marketing. They looked at the protein market and saw a massive inefficiency. The problem wasn't the protein itself. The problem was the delivery system. Powder was inconvenient. It made a mess in your car. It required preparation. JVL hypothesized that if they could put the protein into a liquid form, a ready-to-drink shake that didn't need to be refrigerated until opened and crucially didn't taste like chalk, they could unlock a massive market. This was technically difficult. Whey protein, which is derived from the liquid waste of cheese production, is temperamental. If you heat it up to sterilize it, it tends to denature. It curdles. It turns into a solid block of jelly inside the carton. JVL spent their initial seed capital, roughly $5 million, trying to solve this thermal puzzle. They needed a formula that was high in protein, but low in carbohydrates and sugar. In 1999, they quietly launched Premier Protein. The packaging was not sexy. It looked like a juice box for a giant. It was a Tetra Pak carton, industrial and functional. The design was dominated by text, specifically the nutritional facts. 30 grams protein, 1 gram sugar, low fat. They didn't launch with a Super Bowl ad. They launched where their customers lived, Costco. This decision to partner with Costco early on was the single most important strategic move in the company's history. Costco is not a place for browsing. It is a place for stocking up. By selling Premier Protein in bulk cases of 18 or 24 shakes, they forced the consumer to commit. Once you bought a case, You had 24 shakes in your house. You drank them for breakfast. You drank them after the gym. You drank them because they were there. The early adopters were the gym rats. These were men who viewed food as fuel. To them, Premier Protein was a miracle. It was portable. It had the macros they needed. And compared to the sludge they were used to mixing in the locker room sink, it tasted like a milkshake, from bodybuilders to soccer moms. The flavor profile of the original Premier Protein, chocolate and vanilla, was engineered to be hyper-palatable. It was thick, it was creamy, it coated the mouth. It achieved this using a blend of milk protein concentrate and heavy industrial stabilizers, like cellulose gel and carrageenan. It was a masterpiece of food engineering, a shelf-stable dairy product that could survive a nuclear winter. But in 1999 and 2000, Premier Protein was still trapped in the muscle ghetto. It was seen as a supplement for meatheads. The average suburban mom walking through Costco would push her cart past the pallet of shakes, thinking, that's for bodybuilders, that's for Arnold Schwarzenegger, that's not for me. The founders of JVL knew that to grow, they had to break out of the gym. They had to convince normal people that they, too, were protein deficient. They had to invent a problem that only their shake could solve. And luckily for them, a cultural tidal wave was forming on the horizon that would demonize bread and canonize meat. The low-carb revolution was coming. By the early 2000s, a seismic shift was occurring in the American diet. For decades, the nutritional establishment had preached the gospel of low fat. The food pyramid, endorsed by the government, told Americans to eat 6 to 11 servings of grains a day. Fat was the enemy. Butter was poison. Pasta was health food. But America was getting fatter. The low-fat experiment had failed, replaced by an explosion of high-sugar, fat-free snack foods that left consumers hungry and diabetic. Into this vacuum stepped Dr. Robert Atkins. The Atkins diet, and later the South Beach diet, flipped the script. Dr. Atkins declared that fat was fine, but carbohydrates were the devil. He argued that bread, sugar, and pasta were spiking insulin and locking fat into the cells. The solution? Ketosis. The solution was protein. Suddenly, steak was health food. Bacon was a diet aid. And for the first time in history, the average office worker was counting grams of protein just like a bodybuilder. This was the carbohydrate apocalypse. Bakeries closed. Pasta sales tanked. And Premier Protein found itself holding the winning lottery ticket. JVL Laboratories realized that their shake, originally engineered for muscle synthesis, was accidentally the perfect diet food. It had 30 grams of protein, but crucially, it had only 1 gram of sugar. It was Atkins friendly. The marketing strategy shifted. They stopped talking exclusively about gains and hypertrophy. They started talking about satiety and energy. They positioned the shake not as a post-workout recovery tool, but as a meal replacement. This was a profound psychological pivot. A supplement is something you add to your diet. A meal replacement is something you swap for real food. Premier Protein told busy Americans don't have time to cook eggs, don't want to eat a bagel and get fat, drink this box. Sales at Costco began to accelerate. The palette of shakes moved from the sports nutrition aisle to the front of the store. You started seeing Premier Protein in the carts of soccer moms, accountants, and retirees. It became the breakfast of choice for the commuter class. To capitalize on this momentum, JVL expanded the product line. In 2005, they launched the Premier Protein Bar. If the shake was a chemical feat, the bar was a structural one. In 2005, protein bars were essentially bricks of dense, unflavored taffy. They were hard to chew. They stuck to your teeth. They required a glass of water to swallow. Premier Protein's bar was no different. It was a dense block of soy crisps and whey protein isolate coated in a layer of chocolate-flavored coating, but it delivered the numbers. 30 grams of protein, 3 grams of sugar. The taste was secondary to the utility. People ate them with a grim determination. They ate them in their cars during traffic jams. They ate them at their desks between meetings. The bar wasn't food, it was a macronutrient delivery vehicle. By 2005, revenue had climbed to pass the $10 million mark. The company was profitable, lean, and growing, but they were facing a new threat. The success of the category had attracted predators. A competitor emerged from the shadows, Muscle Milk. Muscle Milk, owned by Cytosport, was the flashy, cool cousin of Premier Protein. Their branding was aggressive. Their bottles looked like classic milk jugs, and their formula tasted incredible, mostly because it was loaded with significantly more fat and carbohydrates than Premier. Muscle Milk tasted like a melted milkshake. Premier Protein tasted like a diet drink. A war for shelf space began. Muscle Milk dominated the convenience stores and gas stations, the immediate consumption market. Premier Protein dug its heels into the club stores, the bulk consumption market. It was a battle of philosophies. Muscle Milk was selling performance and taste. Premier Protein was selling efficiency and math. Premier Protein doubled down on the numbers. They made the 30 grams on the packaging bigger. They made the 1 gram sugar bigger. They knew that their customer was a label reader. They knew that in the age of Atkins, the nutritional fact panel was more important than the flavor profile. By this point, revenue had climbed to approximately $50 million. The founders at Joint Venture Laboratories had built a solid business, but they had hit a hard ceiling. They were privately held, putting out fires every day, and struggling to manage a complex supply chain of co-packers, while demand skyrocketed. To grow beyond the Costco pallet and finally penetrate the massive shelves of Walmart, Target, and Kroger, they didn't just need capital. They needed infrastructure. They needed a giant. The desertification campaign, turning protein into cake to lure moms. On paper, the acquisition of Premier Nutrition by Post Holdings looked like a standard corporate transaction. A big fish eats a little fish, but in reality, it was a desperate transfusion. Post Holdings was a company with anemic blood. Their core business, boxed cereal, was slowly dying. The American breakfast table was changing, and sugary flakes were becoming the villains of the morning routine. CEO Bill Sturritz, a titan of the food industry known for his unsentimental approach to business, realized that to save the company, he needed to stop selling carbohydrates and start selling protein. When the deal closed in 2013, the culture shock was immediate. Premier Nutrition was a California company, laid back, entrepreneurial, focused on the specific needs of the fitness community. Post Holdings was a St. Louis institution, conservative, hierarchical, and focused on quarterly earnings calls. The integration strategy was aggressive. Post didn't just want to own Premier Protein, they wanted to own the entire active nutrition category. They went on a shopping spree. Shortly after buying Premier, Post acquired Dymatize, a hardcore bodybuilding brand famous for its ISO 100 powder. Then, they bought Power Bar, the legendary but fading energy bar company created by athletes in the 80s. Suddenly, Premier Protein wasn't just a standalone brand, it was the crown jewel of a massive new division called the Active Nutrition Group. The logic was simple: synergy. In the food business, leverage is everything. If you are a small company selling one protein shake, Walmart can bully you. They can demand lower prices, squeeze your margins, and kick you off the shelf if you don't comply. But if you are a conglomerate selling protein shakes, protein powders, and energy bars, you walk into the negotiation with a bazooka. Post used this leverage to forcefully expand Premier Protein's footprint. They integrated the supply chains. They consolidated the purchasing of raw whey. When you are buying whey protein for 3 different companies, you get a much better price than when you are buying for one. This reduction in the cost of goods sold instantly improved Premier's profit margins. But there was a hidden cost to this efficiency. In the old days of joint venture laboratories, the founders were obsessed with the product. They knew the farmers. They tasted every batch. Under the Post Holdings regime, the focus shifted to scale. The mandate from St. Louis was clear: grow faster. The new management team installed by Post brought a big food mentality to a sports nutrition product. They looked at the protein shake not as a biological tool, but as a unit of volume. They asked questions like, how can we shave 2 cents off the packaging cost? Can we speed up the bottling line by 10%? This shift in priorities began to erode the soul of the brand. The connection to the hardcore bodybuilding community, the guys who built the brand in the dungeon gyms, began to fray. Premier Protein stopped sponsoring local powerlifting meets and started sponsoring generic wellness events. They stripped away the aggressive masculine imagery associated with the gym. The marketing became softer, cleaner, and more approachable. They weren't targeting the guy bench pressing 300 pounds anymore. They were targeting his wife. By 2014, the transformation was underway. The scrappy startup was gone, replaced by a corporate division with a war chest of capital and a mandate to conquer the one retailer that matters more than any other in America. They were preparing to leave the safe harbor of GNC and sail into the shark-infested waters of the supercenter. In the retail world, there is a saying, you aren't a real brand until you are in Walmart. For the first 15 years of its life, Premier Protein lived comfortably in the club channel. It was a bulk item for heavy users, but to achieve the exponential growth that Post Holdings demanded, they needed to reach the impulse buyer, the person who buys a 4-pack, not a 24-pack. In 2015, the Active Nutrition Group executed Operation Mainstream. They approached the buyers at Walmart, Target, and Kroger with a radical pitch. Traditionally, protein shakes were placed in the pharmacy or dietary supplement aisle, next to the fiber pills and the multivitamins. It was the sick aisle. Nobody shopped there for pleasure. Post argued that Premier Protein shouldn't be in the pharmacy. It should be in the grocery aisle. It should be next to the granola bars. It should be next to the cereal. This placement strategy was psychological warfare. By moving the product out of the medical context and into the food context, they normalized it. They told the consumer, this isn't medicine, this is lunch. To support this move, they redesigned the packaging. The old industrial look was softened. They added images of splashing milk and fresh fruit. They emphasized words like energy and satisfying over muscle and recovery. The result was a demographic explosion. Suddenly, the customer base shifted. It was no longer dominated by men. Women, specifically busy mothers, became the primary purchasers. They saw Premier Protein as the ultimate hack. It was a guilt-free breakfast on the go. It was a way to lose weight without cooking. It was a treat that felt healthy. The sales data from Walmart confirmed the thesis. Premier Protein wasn't cannibalizing sales from other protein shakes. It was stealing sales from fast food. People were buying a 4-pack of Premier Protein instead of a box of Pop-Tarts or a frozen burrito. This mainstream success created a new problem: flavor fatigue. Bodybuilders will drink anything if it has macros. They will choke down unflavored sludge. But suburban moms demand taste. They are used to Starbucks. They are used to Jamba Juice. The standard chocolate and vanilla flavors were fine, but they were boring. To keep this new fickle audience engaged, Premier Protein had to stop acting like a supplement company and start acting like a dessert company. They needed to turn their nutritional payload into a confectionery experience. By 2016, Premier Protein had solved the distribution puzzle. The product was everywhere, but availability does not equal desire. To keep the new mass market consumer coming back, they had to solve the boredom problem. The human brain is wired to crave novelty. Drinking the same chocolate shake every morning for 6 months feels like a punishment. Post Holdings realized that to retain the Walmart shopper, they needed to turn the protein shake into a treat. This marked the beginning of the desertification era. The R&D team in St. Louis was given a new mandate: make it taste like cheating. They began to deconstruct popular American desserts and rebuild them using whey protein, isolate, and artificial sweeteners. They launched bananas and cream. It tasted like banana pudding. They launched peaches and cream. It tasted like a milkshake from a southern diner. They launched cookies and cream, caramel, and pumpkin spice. This strategy was brilliant because it exploited a psychological loophole known as the health halo effect. When a consumer drinks a caramel shake, their taste buds signal sugar, reward, indulgence. But their logical brain reads the label, 1 gram sugar. This cognitive dissonance creates a powerful feedback loop. The consumer feels like they are getting away with something. They get the dopamine hit of a dessert without the guilt of the calories. Premier Protein became the permissible indulgence. It wasn't just breakfast anymore. It was a dessert replacement. People started pouring the caramel flavor into their coffee to make a healthy latte. They started freezing the chocolate flavor to make protein ice cream. The brand leaned heavily into this hack culture. Their social media filled with recipes. How to make Premier Protein pancakes, how to make Premier Protein pudding. They weren't selling a supplement, they were selling an ingredient for a low-carb lifestyle. This flavor expansion drove volume through the roof. The limited edition drops created a frenzy similar to sneaker releases. When pumpkin spice hit the shelves in October, it would sell out in days. But this explosion in SKUs put an immense strain on the manufacturing process. Making chocolate shake is easy. Making a complex flavor like cookies and cream requires precise chemical balancing to ensure the flavor doesn't degrade over the 12-month shelf life. As the sales volume climbed toward the billion-dollar mark, the pressure on the supply chain became dangerous. The company was selling more shakes than they could physically produce. They were running the machines hotter and faster than ever before. And in the rush to fill the orders, the safeguards began to slip. By the end of 2017, Premier Protein was a juggernaut. The brand that had started in the back of a GNC was now generating nearly $700 million in annual sales. It was the growth engine of the entire Post Holdings empire. The trajectory was clear. They were on their way to becoming a billion-dollar brand. But in the world of manufacturing, growth is stress. To meet the insatiable demand from Costco, Walmart, and Target, Post Holdings had to aggressively expand its co-packing network. They couldn't build factories fast enough, so they signed contracts with third-party manufacturers across the Midwest and California. This is a common practice in the food industry, but it introduces a critical vulnerability: loss of control. When you own the factory, you can watch the whey being poured into the mixer. When you outsource to a co-packer who is also making products for Muscle Milk and Slim Fast, you are relying on their paperwork. You are relying on their testing protocols. The pressure to keep the lines moving was immense. Retailers like Walmart impose brutal fines for short shipping. If you promise 10,000 cases and only deliver 8,000, you get fined. If you do it twice, you lose your shelf space. For the co-packers, the mandate was simple. Don't stop the line. This environment created the perfect conditions for margin optimization. In the protein business, the most expensive ingredient is the protein itself. Whey protein. Isolate is a commodity. Its price fluctuates like oil. In 2017, global whey prices were volatile. With costs rising and retailers demanding lower prices, the company faced a critical choice. They needed to hit that 30 grams number on the box to satisfy the bodybuilders. But real whey protein was becoming too expensive to sustain their profits. So, deep in the manufacturing process, a decision was made to take a shortcut. It was a chemical trick designed to fool the standard lab tests. A way to make a cheap product look expensive on paper. The executives in St. Louis continued celebrating their record-breaking sales, unaware that this optimization had left a trail of breadcrumbs. And unfortunately for them, a group of lawyers, armed with advanced testing equipment, had just found the trail and were preparing to knock on the door, paying $9 million to bury the truth. By 2018, Premier Protein was the undisputed king of the category. But in the shadows of the supplement industry, a dirty secret was circulating, a secret that turned the 30 grams protein promise on the front of the box into a question mark. To understand the scandal, you don't need a law degree, you need a chemistry set. You need to understand how the world measures protein. In the food industry, there is no machine that you can pour a shake into and have it beep and say 30 grams of whey. Instead, food scientists use a testing method invented in 1883 called the Kjeldahl method. The Kjeldahl method is a brute force chemical attack. You take a sample of food, boil it in concentrated sulfuric acid, and decompose it until nothing is left but the chemical elements. The test then measures one specific element, nitrogen. The logic is simple. Carbohydrates don't have nitrogen. Fats don't have nitrogen. Only protein has nitrogen. Therefore, if you measure the total nitrogen in the sample and multiply it by a specific factor, you get the total protein count. For over a century, this system worked. It relied on the assumption that the only source of nitrogen in the food was the protein itself. But there was a loophole, a massive, gaping nitrogen-sized loophole. The Kjeldahl test is dumb. It cannot tell the difference between nitrogen bound inside a complex muscle-building whey protein molecule and nitrogen found in cheap, free-form amino acids. Nitrogen is nitrogen. The machine beeps the same way. This created an economic opportunity for deception. Whey protein isolate, the gold standard ingredient that Premier Protein claimed to use, is expensive. It is a commodity traded on global markets. In the mid-2000s, the price of wholesale whey spiked due to high demand from China. It became the most expensive ingredient in the bottle. But glycine and taurine, simple free-form amino acids, are dirt cheap. They are industrial byproducts, often manufactured in bulk in overseas chemical plants. And here is the kicker. Glycine is actually higher in nitrogen percentage than whey protein. If you are an unethical manufacturer, the math is irresistible. Let's say you want to claim 30 grams protein on the label. The honest way, you put in 30 grams of expensive whey protein. The spiking way, you put in 25 grams of whey protein. Then to make up the difference, you add 5 grams of cheap glycine. When the lab runs the Kjeldahl test, the extra nitrogen from the glycine tricks the machine. The result comes back 30 grams of protein. The label is technically accurate according to the test, but biologically it is a lie. This practice is called amino spiking. Why does it matter? Because glycine is not a complete protein. It does not stimulate muscle protein synthesis. It does not help you recover from a workout. It is non-essential filler. It's like buying a gold necklace that is 20% painted lead. It looks like gold, it weighs like gold, but it is worthless. For years, this was the open secret of the powder industry. Bodybuilding brands did it constantly, but in the ready-to-drink market, the world of Walmart and Costco, consumers assumed the big brands were cleaner. They assumed that a public company like Post Holdings, as subject to strict regulations, wouldn't play these games. But the economic pressure to keep the price at $1.50 per shake while whey prices skyrocketed was immense. Something had to give. In 2017, independent testing labs began to look closer. They stopped using just the Kjeldahl method and started using high-performance liquid chromatography. Unlike the brute force acid bath, HPLC separates the ingredients. It can see the profile. It can distinguish between the long, complex chains of whole protein and the short, cheap spikes of free amino acids. When researchers ran the chromatography on various protein products on the market, the graphs didn't look right. They saw the telltale spikes of glycine and taurine. The 30 grams claim began to look like a statistical mirage. And in 2018, a plaintiff named Joseph Chitwood walked into a lawyer's office with a box of Premier Protein and a lab report. He wasn't just a disgruntled customer. He was the first domino in a chain reaction that would cost the company millions. In the world of consumer packaged goods, a class action lawsuit is usually a nuisance, something regarding a font size or a minor technicality. But the lawsuit filed in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of California in 2018 was different. It struck at the very heart of Premier Protein's existence. The case was captioned Chitwood versus Premier Nutrition Corporation. The lead plaintiff, Joseph Chitwood, was not a scientist. He was a regular consumer, a man who had bought Premier protein shakes for years, believing he was paying for 30 grams of high-quality whey protein to support his health. But unlike most consumers, Chitwood decided to test the product. The lawsuit dropped a bombshell allegation. The 30 grams protein on the front of the box was a lie. According to independent testing cited in the complaint, the actual content of whole protein in the shake was significantly lower, often testing in the range of 26 to 28 grams. Now, a deficit of 2 to 4 grams might sound trivial. It's the weight of a penny. But in the world of high-volume manufacturing, those missing grams represent a massive fortune. If you shave 10% of the expensive protein off every shake and replace it with cheap filler, and you sell 100 million shakes a year, you are effectively stealing millions of dollars from the consumer and pocketing it as pure profit. The lawsuit accused Premier Nutrition of engaging in a systematic scheme of amino spiking. It pointed to the ingredient list. While the label touted whey protein, it completely failed to disclose that a portion of the nitrogen count was coming from free-form amino acids that were not chemically bound protein. The complaint argued that under FDA regulations, you cannot count these free amino acids toward the total protein number on the nutrition facts panel. The lawsuit argued that Premier Nutrition knew exactly what they were doing. It alleged that they were exploiting the testing loophole to inflate the numbers, deceiving millions of customers who paid a premium price for a premium dose. When the news of the lawsuit hit the internet, the reaction in the fitness community was nuclear. Bodybuilding.com forums and Reddit threads exploded. For the gym rats, protein is sacred. They measure their intake down to the gram. Finding out that their trusted source might be underdosing them was seen as a personal betrayal. It wasn't just fraud, it was theft of their gains. The comments were vitriolic. I've been drinking this sludge for 5 years. Is this why I haven't been recovering? If they lied about the protein, what else are they lying about? The scandal shattered the blind trust that Premier Protein had enjoyed. For years, consumers assumed that because the product was sold at Costco and Walmart, it was vetted. They assumed the FDA checked every batch. The lawsuit revealed the terrifying reality of the supplement industry. Nobody is checking. The FDA does not pre-approve label claims for supplements or functional foods in the same way they do for drugs. The system relies on the honor code. Post Holdings and Premier Nutrition immediately lawyered up. They filed motions to dismiss. They argued that their testing methods were industry standard. They argued that the FDA regulations were ambiguous about how to calculate protein from amino acids. But they didn't deny the chemistry. They didn't produce a counter test showing 30 grams of pure whey. Instead of fighting the science in a public trial, where their internal emails and R&D notes would be exposed to the world, they chose a different path. They opened their checkbook. They decided that the truth was too expensive to tell, so they would pay for silence instead. In the American legal system, a settlement is not an admission of guilt. It is a calculation. It is a mathematical decision that says, paying you to go away is cheaper than proving I am innocent. For Post Holdings, the parent company of Premier Nutrition, the math on the Chitwood lawsuit was clear. If the case went to trial, it would be a disaster. The plaintiff's lawyers would have the right to discovery. They could subpoena the emails between the R&D team and the manufacturing plants. They could uncover discussions about whey prices, margin pressures, and the decision to use specific amino acids. If a jury saw an email from an executive saying, "Hey, whey is expensive this quarter, let's bump up the glycine," it wouldn't just be a fine, it would be a brand-killing event. It could trigger criminal fraud investigations. So, Premier Nutrition decided to settle. In January 2019, the news broke. Premier Nutrition Corporation agreed to pay $9 million to settle the class action lawsuit. The headline sounded impressive. Premier Protein to pay millions in false labeling settlement. Consumers who had purchased the shakes were eligible to file a claim and receive a check, usually a paltry sum of $20 or $40, depending on how many receipts they saved. But to a company generating nearly $800 million a year in revenue, a $9 million payout was nothing. It was a rounding error, roughly 1% of their annual sales. It was effectively a speeding ticket for a bank robber. The settlement purchased two critical things for the company: silence and continuity. It allowed them to avoid admitting any liability, legally maintaining that they had done nothing wrong, while simultaneously securing their most valuable asset, the label. Crucially, the court order did not force a product recall or a fundamental redesign. They agreed to minor technical tweaks in their testing protocols, but the big, bold 30 grams of protein remained on the front of the box. Consequently, for the average consumer walking through Costco, absolutely nothing changed. The box looked the same, the price was the same, and the scandal remained a secret contained entirely within the fine print of legal blogs and bodybuilding forums. When stocks soared, but factories collapsed. However, inside the industry, the settlement sent a shockwave. It was a warning shot. It signaled that the Wild West days of protein spiking were coming to an end. Other brands scrambled to clean up their formulas. The risk of getting sued was now higher than the cost of just buying real protein. For Premier Protein, the $9 million check bought them silence, but it couldn't buy back the trust of the influencer class. The fitness influencers, the YouTubers and Instagrammers who had once promoted Premier Protein as the gold standard began to distance themselves. They didn't want to be associated with a fake product. They started promoting clean label brands, companies that proudly advertised no spiking and third-party tested. This created a trust deficit. Premier Protein had saved its mass market business, but it had lost its core credibility with the fitness elite. And just as the company was trying to quietly navigate this PR minefield, a new challenge emerged, one that would force them to rethink their entire existence. The world was about to enter a global health crisis, and suddenly, people weren't just worried about muscle, they were worried about survival. The $9 million settlement check cleared, but the stain remained. In the digital age, scandals don't disappear, they just become search results. If you Googled Premier Protein in 2019 or 2020, the autocomplete didn't suggest flavors or recipes. It suggested lawsuit and fake protein. This marked the beginning of the trust deficit. The consumer landscape had fundamentally shifted. The blind faith era was over. A new generation of consumers, driven by TikTok detectives and wellness bloggers, started demanding radical transparency. They didn't trust the label. They trusted the third party. Websites like Labdoor and Clean Label Project rose to power. These organizations bought products off the shelf, tested them in independent labs, and published the results for free. They gave brands a grade, A, B, C, or F. Premier Protein found itself under a microscope. Every batch was now being scrutinized by the internet. This pressure forced a quiet, unannounced evolution inside the company. Post Holdings realized they couldn't afford another scandal. Slowly, without a press release, they began to clean up the formula. They tightened the specifications with their co-packers. They reduced the reliance on free-form amino acids. They started moving toward clean label protocols, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. But the competition had already pounced. New brands emerged that were built specifically to kill Premier Protein. Brands like Organ and Fairlife attacked Premier's weakness. Fairlife, owned by Coca-Cola, was the most dangerous threat. Their core power shakes didn't use powder. They used real liquid milk that had been filtered to remove the sugar. They tasted better, smoother, less chemical, and they had a cleaner ingredient list. Premier Protein was suddenly the old guard. It looked like the processed chemical option in a world that was moving toward natural and grass-fed. The marketing team at Post Holdings faced a crisis. How do you sell a product that is inherently processed, a shelf-stable milkshake with a 12-month expiration date, to a world that wants fresh, organic food? They decided to pivot the narrative away from ingredients and toward lifestyle. They stopped talking about what was in the box and started talking about what the box did for you. It gave you time. It gave you freedom. It was the hack for a busy life. And then, in March 2020, the world stopped. The COVID-19 pandemic arrived. Gyms closed. The gym rats who cared about amino spiking were stuck at home. But a new panic set in. Americans were terrified of gaining the quarantine 15. They were terrified for their health. In a strange twist of fate, the pandemic saved Premier Protein from its reputation crisis. When panic buying started, people didn't care about clean labels. They cared about shelf life. They wanted food that wouldn't spoil. Costco shelves were stripped bare. The demand for Premier Protein exploded again, not because of muscle, but because of survival. The trust deficit was temporarily masked by the supply deficit. But the executives at Bellring Brands knew this was a temporary reprieve. To survive the next decade, they couldn't just be a panic buy. They had to reinvent the brand for a digital, skeptical world. They had to leave the dark truth behind and build a new empire. In March 2020, the American consumer underwent a sudden, radical psychological shift As the lockdowns began, the hierarchy of needs collapsed. People weren't buying for pleasure, they were buying for survival. The grocery store became a battlefield, and in the panic buying frenzy that stripped shelves of toilet paper and canned beans, a strange thing happened. The protein aisle was empty too. For years, Premier Protein had marketed itself as convenient nutrition. During the pandemic, that slogan took on a literal, almost military meaning. Americans were terrified. They were trapped in their homes. They were scared of food shortages. And crucially, they were scared of gaining weight. The media began warning about the quarantine 15, the 15 pounds everyone was going to gain from sitting on the couch and stress-eating sourdough bread. Premier Protein became the antidote to this anxiety. It was shelf-stable. You could buy a case of 18 shakes at Costco, throw it in your garage, and know that you had a month's worth of breakfast that wouldn't spoil. It was a prepper food for suburbanites. It was also a diet control mechanism. With gyms closed, people felt they had lost control of their bodies. Drinking a Premier Protein shake became a daily ritual of discipline. It was a way to say, I might be stuck at home wearing sweatpants, but I am still taking care of myself. Sales data from Q2 and Q3 of 2020 showed a massive spike. Household penetration, the percentage of American homes with Premier Protein in the pantry, jumped to nearly 8%. That is a staggering number for a supplement. It meant Premier Protein was no longer a niche product. It was in nearly 1 in 10 homes. But this demand wasn't coming from bodybuilders. The gyms were closed. The bro market had evaporated. The new volume was coming from the GLP-1 demographic. Though the drug Ozempic wasn't mainstream yet, the mindset was there. It was coming from diabetics, from the elderly who were terrified of frailty, and from remote workers who needed a quick lunch between Zoom calls. Premier Protein had accidentally positioned itself as the perfect apocalypse ration. It was cheap, it was durable, and it was nutritionally dense. However, there was a dark side to this boom. The demand was artificial. It was driven by hoarding. People weren't drinking 50% more, they were buying 50% more to store. And this sudden, violent spike in orders sent a shock wave through the supply chain that the company was not prepared to handle. The factories were running at 100% capacity, but then the virus hit the factories. Workers got sick. Shifts were canceled. The delicate dance of just-in-time manufacturing collapsed. And just as Premier Protein was enjoying its moment as the essential item, the corporate overlords at Post Holdings decided it was the perfect time to execute a massive financial maneuver. They were going to spin the brand off. They were going to take the golden goose and set it free. While consumers were hoarding shakes in their garages, the executives at Post Holdings were busy engineering a different kind of product, a stock ticker. For years, Premier Protein had been the growth engine hiding inside a dying cereal company. Post Holdings was trading at a low multiple because Wall Street viewed it as a boring legacy food business. But inside that boring business was the active nutrition division, which was growing at double digits. CEO Bill Sturritz and his team realized that the market wasn't giving them credit for Premier Protein. Tech investors and growth investors didn't buy Post stock because they didn't want to own grape nuts. So they decided to execute a spin-off. In late 2019, just before the pandemic hit, Post Holdings carved out its active nutrition unit and took it public as a separate company called BellRing Brands. The logic was pure financial engineering. By creating a standalone company, investors could buy stock directly in the protein boom without the baggage of the cereal business. BellRing Brands would be a pure-play growth stock. Premier Protein was the absolute star of this new company. It accounted for nearly 80% of BellRing's total revenue. Dymatize and PowerBar were just supporting acts. BellRing Brands was Premier Protein. The IPO raised over $480 million. It was a massive success. It validated the journey from a small California lab to a Wall Street darling. But the spinoff created a new pressure: quarterly expectations. As a division of Post, Premier Protein could hide a bad quarter. As a standalone public company, every blip in sales was scrutinized by analysts. The leadership team at BellRing, led by CEO Darcy Davenport, was under immense pressure to show continuous growth. This pressure hit right as the supply chain began to buckle under the weight of the pandemic. In 2020 and 2021, BellRing Brands found itself in a paradoxical position. Demand was at an all-time high. Retailers were begging for product. But BellRing couldn't make enough. They didn't own their own factories. Remember, they relied on a network of third-party co-packers, and those co-packers were in chaos. Raw materials were scarce. The price of whey protein skyrocketed. The price of plastic caps went up. The price of cardboard boxes went up. But the biggest bottleneck was something incredibly mundane: Tetra Pak cartons. The aseptic cardboard cartons that Premier Protein used were in global shortage. Every beverage company wanted them. BellRing Brands was fighting for allocation against giants like Nestlé and Danone. Investors looked at the quarterly reports and saw a disturbing trend. Revenue was up, but unfulfilled orders were massive. They were leaving millions of dollars on the table simply because they couldn't put liquid in a box, when real milk defeated chemicals. And while Premier Protein was struggling to fill the shelves, a shark smelled blood in the water. A competitor with its own dedicated supply chain, its own cows, and a superior technology was preparing to launch a full-scale invasion of the category. By 2021, the apocalypse pantry buying spree had settled into a steady, relentless demand. But for BellRing Brands, the celebration was over. They were now in crisis management mode. The company's decision years earlier to rely 100% on co-man had been a financial stroke of genius. It kept their overhead low and their margins high. They didn't have to pay for factories. They just paid for the finished product. But in 2021, that strategy backfired. When the global supply chain fractured, asset light became asset vulnerable. Because BellRing didn't own the plants, they didn't control the schedule. When a co-packer in Ohio had a COVID outbreak, the line shut down. When a co-packer in California ran out of aseptic packaging, they prioritized their biggest clients first. And sometimes that wasn't Premier Protein. The shortage hit Costco the hardest. Costco is Premier Protein's lifeblood. It accounts for a massive percentage of their volume. But Costco has a strict rule. If you can't fill the pallet, we pull the SKU. They hate empty space. In mid-2021, members started noticing the Star of Death appearing on Premier Protein pallets. Social media groups like Costco Finds were filled with panic. Where are the shakes? Is Premier Protein discontinued? To survive, BellRing had to institute a brutal policy: allocation. They had to play God. They had to decide which retailers got product and which ones got nothing. They prioritized Costco and Walmart and cut off smaller grocery chains and convenience stores. They cut marketing spend because there was no point in advertising a product you couldn't buy. This scarcity created a vacuum. And in the beverage industry, vacuums are filled instantly. While Premier Protein's shelves sat empty, a new bottle began to appear. It wasn't a cardboard carton. It was a sleek white plastic bottle. It looked premium. It looked modern. And most dangerously, it claimed to have 26 grams or 42 grams of protein, and it tasted like real chocolate milk. Fairlife had arrived. Owned by the Coca-Cola company, Fairlife didn't have supply chain issues. They owned the farms. They owned the cows. They owned the massive filtration plants. While Premier was begging co-packers for line time, Fairlife was flooding the market. Consumers, forced to switch brands because Premier was out of stock, tried Fairlife Core Power, and they realized something terrifying for BellRing. It tasted better. Premier Protein had always had a distinct protein taste, a slight chalkiness, a thick artificial sweetener aftertaste. Fairlife used ultra-filtered milk. It was smooth. It was thin. It tasted like a treat, not a supplement. The supply chain collapse of 2021 didn't just cost BellRing millions in lost sales. It broke the habit loop. It forced loyal customers to cheat on the brand. And once they tasted the competition, many of them never came back. By 2022, the protein shake aisle had transformed into a war zone. For a decade, Premier Protein had enjoyed a near monopoly on the high-protein, low-sugar segment. Muscle Milk was too caloric. Atkins was too diet-focused. Premier was the Goldilocks zone. But Fairlife Core Power was a different beast entirely. Fairlife wasn't just another supplement brand mixing powder into water. They were a technology company backed by the infinite resources of Coca-Cola. Their secret weapon was ultrafiltration. Instead of adding whey powder to water, Fairlife took real cow's milk and ran it through a series of filters to remove the lactose while concentrating the natural protein and calcium. The result was a liquid that had the texture and flavor profile of fresh milk, because it was fresh milk, just engineered. The difference in taste was undeniable. In blind taste tests conducted by influencers on TikTok and YouTube, Fairlife consistently destroyed Premier Protein. Premier was described as thick and artificial. Fairlife was described as melted ice cream. This triggered the taste war. Premier Protein had built its empire on macros. Fairlife attacked with experience. They argued that you didn't have to suffer to get your protein. Their Core Power Elite line offered 42 grams of protein, beating Premier's 30 grams, and still tasted better. The pricing dynamic shifted. Fairlife was significantly more expensive, often $3.50 or $4 per bottle compared to Premier's $1.50 or $2. But in the post-pandemic world, consumers were willing to pay for premium indulgence. Fairlife also attacked Premier on the clean label front. Fairlife's ingredient list was shorter. It didn't rely as heavily on gums and stabilizers. It didn't have the history of amino spiking lawsuits. To defend its territory, BellRing brands had to scramble. They ramped up their R&D budget. They launched new flavors like root beer float and cake batter delight, doubling down on the dessert strategy to compete with Fairlife's taste. They also leaned heavily into their price advantage. As inflation hit in late 2022, Premier Protein positioned itself as the value king. Why pay $4 for Fairlife when you can get 30 grams of protein for $1.60? This strategy saved them from total collapse. While Fairlife stole the premium, high-income customer, Premier Protein, held onto the bulk buying families at Costco and Walmart. They became the Bud Light of protein, reliable, ubiquitous, and affordable, while Fairlife became the craft beer. But the market share loss was real. In 2019, Premier Protein was the undisputed number one. By the end of 2022, they were in a dogfight. They had lost the innovation mantle. They were now the legacy incumbent fighting off a superior technology. And as 2023 approached, the leadership at BellRing Brands realized that to win the next decade, they couldn't just sell shakes. They had to become a lifestyle. They had to escape the grocery aisle and enter the digital world. Resurrection via TikTok. As 2023 dawned, the narrative around Premier Protein shifted from crisis to stabilization. The supply chain nightmares of 2021 were fading. The shelves at Costco were full again. But a new invisible enemy had emerged: inflation. The cost of whey protein had stabilized, but everything else, transportation, packaging, labor, was more expensive. Across the grocery store, prices were spiking by 20 to 30%. Consumers were trading down. They were swapping brand name cereal for generic. They were buying cheaper meat. In this environment, Bell-Ring Brands made a strategic decision that defined their 2023 performance. While competitors like Fairlife raised prices aggressively, Premier Protein decided to fight to keep their price point accessible. They understood their core customer. The Costco shopper is value conscious. They calculate the price per gram of protein. Even if Fairlife tasted better, if it cost 50 cents more per bottle, a family buying 40 bottles a month would do the math and stick with Premier. Bell-Ring executed a masterclass in revenue growth management. Instead of a flat price hike, they used subtle levers. They reduced the frequency of discounts. They optimized the pack sizes, shifting some retailers from 4-packs to 12-packs to drive volume. They leaned on their massive scale to negotiate better rates with their new diversified network of co-packers. The strategy worked. In their fiscal year 2023 report, Bell-Ring Brands posted net sales of $1.67 billion, a massive increase of 21.5% from the previous year. Crucially, the data showed that they weren't just winning on price, they were winning on habit. Inflation usually kills brand loyalty, but protein shakes had become sticky. For millions of Americans, the shake wasn't a luxury. It was breakfast. It was cheaper than eggs. It was cheaper than a Starbucks latte. Premier Protein had successfully positioned itself as an inflation hedge for the consumer's morning routine. CEO Darcy Davenport highlighted this in earnings calls, noting that Premier Protein's household penetration was hitting all-time highs. The trade-down effect was actually helping them. People who used to buy $8 smoothies at a juice bar were now buying $2 Premier shakes. But winning on price is a dangerous long-term game. It leaves you vulnerable to a commodity race to the bottom. To build a sustainable empire, Bell-Ring needed to be more than just the cheap option. They needed to be culturally relevant. They needed to prove that a 25-year-old brand could still speak the language of the internet. By 2023, the old marketing playbook, sponsoring bodybuilding shows and buying ads in Men's Health magazine, was officially dead. The center of gravity for the fitness world had shifted from the weight room to the living room and from the television to the smartphone. Bell-Ring Brands realized that to keep growing, they needed to stop chasing the gym rat and start chasing the lifestyle optimizer. They found their salvation in a viral trend they didn't even invent: Profi. Profi was a TikTok phenomenon that exploded in late 2022 and carried through 2023. It started organically. Users realized that if they poured a carton of caramel or vanilla Premier Protein into their iced coffee, it tasted exactly like a Starbucks latte, but with 30 grams of protein and 1 gram of sugar. It was the ultimate life hack. It solved two problems at once: the need for caffeine and the need for protein. Premier Protein's marketing team was smart enough not to ruin it. Instead of forcing corporate ads onto the platform, they leaned into the user-generated content. They sent PR packages to thousands of micro-influencers, nurses, teachers, busy moms, who were already posting about their morning Profi routines. They reformulated their marketing to emphasize this use case. They stopped showing people chugging the shake after a bench press. They started showing people pouring it into glass tumblers filled with ice and cold brew. They positioned Premier Protein not as a supplement, but as a better coffee creamer. This pivot fundamentally changed the consumption occasion. A post-workout shake happens maybe 3 times a week. Morning coffee happens every single day. By attaching themselves to the coffee habit, they unlocked massive volume. Simultaneously, they sought to elevate the brand's image through a strategic partnership with Peloton. Peloton was the brand of the pandemic, premium, aspirational, and community-driven. In 2023, Premier Protein announced a major collaboration with the connected fitness giant. They launched Premier Protein X Peloton challenges. They put their branding inside the app. This was a branding masterstroke. Peloton is expensive hardware. It signals status. By associating with Peloton, Premier Protein was signaling that it wasn't just a cheap Walmart bulk item. It was part of the elite, connected fitness ecosystem. It allowed them to borrow Peloton's cool factor. The campaign focused on the concept of good energy. It moved away from the no pain, no gain mentality of the 90s and toward the self-care mentality of the 2020s. The results of this digital pivot were clear in the demographics. The average age of the Premier Protein consumer dropped. They were capturing Gen Z and younger millennials who didn't care about amino spiking scandals from 5 years ago. They only cared that the shake made their coffee taste like a frappuccino and looked good in a Get Ready With Me video. Bellring Brands had successfully transitioned from a bodybuilding product to a lifestyle hack. But as they captured this younger, more digitally savvy audience, they faced a new risk. This generation reads labels differently. They don't just count macros, they check for chemicals. And Premier Protein's ingredient list, loaded with carrageenan, artificial flavors, and industrial stabilizers, was beginning to look archaic in the age of clean eating. To secure the future, they would need to do the one thing big food companies hate most. They would need to change the recipe that made them billions. By 2024, Premier Protein had a TikTok problem. The app that had popularized Profi was also the home of wellness influencers, an army of self-taught nutritionists who stalked the grocery aisles, reading ingredient labels, and scaring their followers. For these influencers, Premier Protein was an easy target. While the macros were perfect, the micro-ingredients were not. The ingredient list of a 2015-era Premier Protein shake read like a chemistry textbook. It contained carrageenan, a thickener derived from seaweed that had become a boogeyman in the wellness world, accused of causing gut inflammation. It contained artificial colors. It contained generic natural and artificial flavors. In the face of competitors like Organ, Premier Protein looked like a dinosaur from the chemical age. Bellring Brands initiated a quiet, high-stakes project, the silent reformulation. Reformulating a billion-dollar product is terrifying. If you change the taste even slightly, you risk a new Coke disaster. You risk alienating the loyal Costco mom who has drunk the same vanilla shake every morning for 10 years. The R&D team had to perform a magic trick. Remove the bad ingredients without changing the viscosity or the flavor profile. They began to phase out carrageenan, replacing it with cleaner, less controversial stabilizers like Gelen gum. They started sourcing higher quality cocoa for the chocolate flavor to reduce the reliance on artificial flavorings. They tweaked the sweetener blend to reduce the metallic aftertaste that had plagued the brand for years. Crucially, they didn't run a Super Bowl ad announcing now all natural. Doing so would only highlight how unnatural the previous version was. Instead, they did it through stealth renovations. Consumers simply noticed that the packaging looked a little cleaner. The font was sharper. The no artificial growth hormones claim became more prominent. And when they turned the box over, the list of unpronounceable words was shorter. This reformulation was a defensive moat. It took away the primary weapon of the critics. When a wellness influencer picked up the new box to criticize it, they found fewer things to complain about. It also allowed Premier Protein to expand into the natural channel. They launched the Premier Protein with Oats line, a hybrid product aiming for the breakfast market, which featured whole grain oats and positioned itself as a real food smoothie rather than a chemical supplement. By cleaning up the label, Bellring Brands was future-proofing the asset. They knew that the regulatory environment in Europe and California was getting stricter regarding food additives. They were moving the battleship before the tide went out, but fixing the liquid wasn't enough. The leadership team knew that relying on a single product, the 11-ounce shake, was dangerous. If consumer tastes shifted away from dairy, or if a new delivery system emerged, they would be vulnerable. To build a true empire, they needed to conquer new aisles of the grocery store. By 2025, Bellring Brands had a dominant position in the ready-to-drink shake market. But in the world of CPG, standing still is death. The leadership team knew that relying on a single format, the liquid carton, was a strategic vulnerability. If a consumer got tired of drinking their breakfast, Premier Protein lost a sale. If a consumer wanted a snack instead of a drink, Premier Protein lost a sale. To solve this, Bellring executed the pantry invasion strategy. The goal was simple: own every protein occasion in the day. They revitalized the powder business. For years, the big tubs of Premier Protein powder were an afterthought, sold mostly online. But with inflation pinching wallets, powder became attractive again. They redesigned the tubs, improved the mixability to prevent clumping, and pushed them aggressively into Walmart alongside the shakes. They completely overhauled the bar business. The old Premier Protein bars were dense and chewy, relics of 2005 technology. They launched a new generation of bars with soft-baked textures and crispy layers, mimicking the success of competitors like Quest and Bear Bells. They positioned these not as meal replacements, but as snack upgrades. But the most ambitious move was the expansion into breakfast foods. In 2025, Premier Protein began testing protein pancakes and protein cereal. This was a full circle moment. Remember, Post Holdings had bought them. Now, Premier Protein was becoming the modern version of cereal. They were capitalizing on the trend of functional food. Consumers didn't want to stop eating pancakes, they just wanted pancakes that didn't make them fat. This diversification created a flywheel effect. A customer might drink a shake for breakfast on Monday, eat a bar for a snack on Tuesday, and make protein pancakes on Sunday. Premier Protein wasn't just a product, it was a nutritional ecosystem. Bellring also began to look at M&A. With a strong balance sheet and a high stock price, they were positioned to be a buyer. Rumors swirled about potential acquisitions in the plant-based space or the hydration space. The strategy was to build Bellring into the Procter & Gamble of active nutrition, a holding company with a brand for every need state. This expansion secured their financial future. Revenue for the fiscal year 2025 was projected to hit $1.8 billion. The stock price of Bellring Brands was outperforming the broader food index. They had survived the lawsuits. They had survived the supply chain collapse. They had survived the Fairlife invasion. They were no longer a scrappy startup or a scandalous outlier. They were the establishment. But as Premier Protein solidified its place as the king of commoditized nutrition, one final question remained, a philosophical question that haunts the entire industry. What have we actually done to food? As we look back at the 25-year history of Premier Protein, we are left with a story that is less about health and more about optimization. Premier Protein did not invent whey protein. They did not invent the milkshake. What they invented was convenience. They took a biological necessity, protein, and turned it into a utility bill. They made it as easy to consume as turning on a tap. They stripped away the ritual of cooking, the mess of powders, and the stigma of the gym. They put 30 grams of muscle-building fuel into a cardboard box and sold it to soccer moms at Costco for $1.50. In doing so, they fundamentally changed the American diet. Before Premier Protein, high protein was a diet for athletes. Today, it is the default setting for the entire country. Walk through a grocery store and you will see protein stamped on everything: chips, water, cookies, oatmeal. Premier Protein was the battering ram that broke down the wall. But there is a cost to this convenience. The amino spiking scandal of 2018 was a glimpse behind the curtain. It reminded us that when we outsource our nutrition to industrial conglomerates, we lose visibility. We stop eating food and start eating macros. We trust a chemistry lab to assemble our lunch. The success of Premier Protein, despite the lawsuits, despite the processed ingredients, despite the taste, proves that modern humans value efficiency above almost anything else. We are willing to drink a sterilized, homogenized, stabilized liquid because we are too busy to scramble an egg. Is Premier Protein healthy? That is the wrong question. Is it healthier than a donut? Yes. Is it healthier than a piece of grilled salmon? No. It is a bridge. It is a tool. It is the astronaut food for the suburban commuter. Bellring Brands has built a fortress around this need. They have survived the clean eating trends and the paleo fads because they understand a fundamental truth. Nobody wants to be fat, but everybody wants to eat cake. By making a protein shake that tastes like cake batter delight, they solved the American paradox. They allowed us to have our cake and lose weight too. The legacy of Premier Protein is not in the gym. It is in the minivan cup holder. It is in the office fridge. It is the silent fuel of a tired, busy, overworked nation that just needs to get to 5 p.m. without crashing. It is the commodity of muscle, and business is good.